She was a neurosurgeon, brilliant, controlled, untouchable. She had spent 31 years building a life so perfectly ordered that nothing could reach her. Then her dying father whispered a name she had never heard. 2 words, and everything she thought she knew about herself began to fall apart. The most dangerous man in Boston did not threaten her. He did not chase her. He simply told her the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was the one thing she had no defense against. He locked the door, not to trap her, but because she had already chosen to walk in. And now there was no way out. Some people are born to lead, some are born to rule, and some carry secrets so heavy that the only person who can finally speak them out loud is the last person you would ever expect. This channel does not tell stories about crime. This channel tells stories about mindset, about backbone, and about the secrets behind real power that no classroom will ever teach you. Only those who have truly lived at the edge of everything understand what it costs to stand for something that lasts. This story will teach you that patience is not weakness, that the most powerful move a person can make is sometimes to wait, to build, to hold the truth carefully until the moment it can do what force never could. And that belonging, real belonging, is not something you are given. It is something you build, quietly, in kitchens with cold coffee and honest silence. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The next story is already waiting.
My father died on a Tuesday in November. Not dramatically, not the way people die in movies, with something profound to say, and enough time to say it. He died in a hospital bed on the 3rd floor of Massachusetts General, with the afternoon light coming through the window at the wrong angle and a nurse adjusting his IV line for the 4th time that hour. I was holding his hand. I am a neurosurgeon. I have held the hands of dying people more times than I can count. I thought I knew what it felt like. I did not know what it felt like when it was him. He told me 2 things before he went. The second thing he said was that he was sorry. The first thing, the very first thing, was a name. Dominic Reyes. He said I was born into a world connected to that name, that he had taken me out of that world when I was 6 years old, that the price he paid was something he never had the courage to tell me about in all the years in between. Then he closed his eyes, and I was left standing in a hospital room with a name I had never heard, holding the hand of a man who was no longer there to explain it. That was 3 months ago. I spent those 3 months doing what I do best, working, keeping my hands busy and my mind focused on things that have clear answers. Brain surgeries have clear answers. Either the patient lives or the patient does not. Either the bleeding stops or it does not. There is no room for ambiguity in the operating room. No room for the kind of questions that sit at the back of your skull at 2 in the morning and will not leave. I am telling you this so you understand who I am before everything changed. Because on the night this story really begins, I was in operating room 4 at Massachusetts General at 2:17 in the morning, and I was fine. I was completely, totally, professionally fine. The patient was a 52-year-old man named Gerald, a construction foreman who had run a red light in his pickup truck and met a concrete barrier at 45 miles per hour. Intracranial hematoma. The kind of case that gets complicated fast if you let it. My resident team had been on their feet for 6 hours. They were tired in the way young doctors get tired when they realize that medicine does not pause for human limitations. I was not tired. Not because I am stronger than they are, but because I learned in my first year of residency that fatigue is a choice you can postpone when someone's life is in your hands. You make that trade. You pay for it later. You make it anyway. My voice through the operating room microphone was steady, each instrument request placed at the right moment, each adjustment made without hesitation. One of the nurses told me later that operating with me felt like being inside a very well-run machine. I took it as a compliment. I think she meant it as one. Camera tight on my eyes above the mask. If this were a film, amber brown, unblinking, focused entirely on what was in front of me, that is who I am in the operating room. That is the version of myself I trust completely. It is the version of myself I was about to lose. After the surgery, I stood at the hallway sink on the 8th floor and washed my hands. 3:30 in the morning. Boston below the window looked the way cities look very late at night, which is to say smaller than they feel during the day, quieter, more honest. A line of streetlights going amber down Fruit Street. An ambulance somewhere in the distance, not rushing. I thought about my apartment. Clean. Organized. A kitchen table with one chair pulled out because I only ever use one chair. A refrigerator stocked for exactly 1 week because I shop once and waste nothing. One painting on the wall that I bought because the color matched the light in the room. No photographs anywhere. I had lived in that apartment for 4 years, and it had never felt lonely to me, until 3 months ago. My phone rang. Nora Walsh, video call, 3:20 a.m. from 3 floors down where she was finishing her own shift. Nora is an internal medicine physician and my closest friend, which is a title that comes with the specific job requirement of telling me things I do not want to hear. Camilla said, "I am fine." Nora said, "You say that the way people say the leg is still attached after an accident." Camilla said, "I am genuinely fine. Go to sleep." She ended the call, stood in the empty corridor, cold fluorescent light, no one else around, and noticed, for the first time, that completely alone and completely at peace are not always the same thing. She had been confusing them for years. 3 days later, a plain envelope appeared at the hospital reception desk with her name on it. Handwritten, dark blue ink, no return address. The penmanship was unnaturally even, the way handwriting looks when someone is being very deliberate about each letter. She opened it in the elevator. Alone, one sheet of paper, an address in South Boston, and a single line. "You have questions. I have answers. Come alone. Dr." Her whole body went cold from the neck down. Not fear. She had stood in operating rooms with more immediate stakes than any face-to-face meeting. This was something else. The feeling of receiving confirmation that the thing you have been trying not to believe is still real. She read the address twice, then went to the bathroom and burned the paper over the sink, using a lighter from her coat pocket that she carried for reasons she could never fully explain, and watched the ash dissolve down the drain. She walked back out into the hallway with a normal face and began her day. Here is what she did not say out loud to anyone, including herself. She had already memorized the address. She did not need to burn the paper to forget it. She burned it to buy herself more time to pretend she had not already decided. We do that, all of us. We know the answer before we admit it. We create small rituals of delay so that the decision feels considered rather than inevitable. Burning that piece of paper was not an act of caution. It was theater. A performance for an audience of one, in a bathroom on the 8th floor of a hospital, at 7 in the morning. I knew where I was going. I had known since the moment I read those 2 letters. Dr. The question was only how much longer I was willing to pretend otherwise. The answer, it turned out, was 3 more days. Because on the 3rd day after the envelope appeared, the hospital received notification of an unscheduled pharmaceutical audit, specifically targeting 2 anesthetic agents whose inventory numbers I had been quietly tracking for nearly 2 years. I had filed a formal report about the discrepancy 18 months earlier. I was told it was under review. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. The numbers continued to not add up, and the people responsible for investigating them continued to not investigate them. And now, suddenly, there was an audit. I am a neurosurgeon. My entire professional life is built on pattern recognition. I am trained to look at symptoms and work backward to causes, to see the connections that aren't immediately obvious, to ask why certain things are happening in a specific sequence at a specific time. I looked at the pattern in front of me. A name on a piece of paper connected to a pharmaceutical distribution network. A 2-year discrepancy in controlled medications, a sudden audit that appeared the same week as that piece of paper, and the 2 letters DR linking all of it together. Not coincidence. I could not continue practicing medicine in that building while pretending I did not see what that building was connected to. Not out of some abstract principle, because I am a physician and I am not built to ignore a diagnosis once I have recognized the symptoms. That evening at 9:47, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot with the engine off. The address was in my head. I did not need to type it anywhere. I sat there for exactly 12 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. Then I started the car. There are decisions we make, and there are decisions that were already made that we are only catching up to. That night, I thought I was choosing to drive to that address, but I understand now that I had already chosen the moment my father said that name 3 months earlier in a room with afternoon light at the wrong angle. Everything after that was only the time I needed to be brave enough to stop pretending. The warehouse looked exactly like a warehouse from the outside, which I would later understand was entirely the point. Nothing about Dominic Reyes announces itself. Everything about him exists beneath the surface of what you expect to see. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and walked in. Warm, amber lighting. Tall shelves along the walls holding real books. Not decorative books. Not books purchased by the yard because they photograph well. Books with broken spines and paper bookmarks, and the particular kind of wear that comes from being read more than once. The smell of coffee and old paper. A man sitting at a desk in the center of the room. Reading. He did not look up when I walked in. He finished the sentence he was on, or maybe the paragraph, and then he set the book down with its pages open against the desk. I noticed the title, The Remains of the Day, a novel about a man who spends his entire life in service to someone else's vision and at the very end realizes he does not know what he himself ever wanted. I filed that away. He looked up. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they are confirming, not evaluating for the first time. Like he had already formed a complete picture from partial information and was now simply verifying the details. He did not stand. He did not offer a greeting. He said, "You burned the note but memorized the address. That tells me everything I needed to know about you, Dr. Voss." I stood straight. I said, "Then tell me what you know about where I came from. No preamble, no warmth, no social theater. This is the first thing I registered about Dominic Reyes. He does not waste words. Every sentence he chooses to say is a sentence he has decided is worth saying." He stood, not abruptly, just smoothly, and walked to a small kitchenette in the corner. He poured coffee into 2 cups without asking whether I wanted any. Set one in front of me. Sat back down across from me. He said, "You researched me before you came here. Not a question." Camilla said, "Everything I could find." Dominic said, "And?" Camilla said, "Not enough to know whether I should be here." Something shifted in his eyes. Not a smile, just recognition. He said, "Exactly. That is why I contacted you directly." He told me about Marco Vega. Not everything, not in chronological order, but nothing false. A former partner who had tried to use a child as payment for a debt. Dominic refused. He said, "Children are not currency." I have never agreed with that regardless of whose they were. I was testing every statement against itself the way I test a patient history, watching his micro-expressions, tracking his breathing, noting the direction of his gaze on specific words. This is occupational reflex. It runs continuously without requiring conscious activation. The result was something I had not expected. He was not lying. Not that I thought him incapable of deception, but in that room, at that moment, everything he said was true. And that was more unsettling than any threat he could have made. I had arrived prepared to fight against a dangerous person. Nobody prepares to fight against someone who is simply telling the truth. He said, "Victor Salazar knows your name. He will use you to reach me whether you choose to be involved or not." I contacted you first because you have the right to know where you are standing before someone pushes you into a game whose rules you do not know. I asked, why not just arrange protection for me without any of this? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, because you have the right to look at the person who is speaking to you, not receive information through a third party. That is what I owe you. That sentence landed somewhere I was not prepared for. He laid out the proposal plainly. I would serve as a medical consultant for a community clinic project he was building, completely legitimate, aimed at people without health insurance. In exchange, he would provide every file he had on Marco Vega and my origins. If I refused, he would arrange protection at a distance and never contact me again. My choice. 48 hours to decide. I stood up, said I needed time, moved toward the door. He stood too, not rushing. He walked to the door of the room and locked it. The sound of that lock is something I still hear sometimes. A small sound. Final. He turned back to face me. His expression was not threatening. It was something closer to the face of a surgeon who needs a patient to hear something before they leave the consultation room. Focused, direct, without apology. He said, before you walk out, I need you to understand something, not to convince you to stay, so that you do not lie to yourself afterward. I stayed still. My heart was beating in an irregular way that I recognized as the body's signal that something important is happening. Pay attention, he said. You walked into this room on your own 2 feet. You memorized that address after burning the paper. You came here because you wanted to know, not because anyone forced you. I am not keeping you here. But I need you to understand this. You now know Victor Salazar's name. You know he knows yours. You know all of it is connected. You cannot go home and pretend this evening did not happen. The truth does not allow that. I did not lock you in this room. The truth locked you in this room. I just closed the door so you would stop lying to yourself. Long silence. He said, you have 48 hours. But whichever way you decide, you are not the same person you were 3 hours ago. That is the truth you chose the moment you opened that door and walked in. He unlocked the door, stepped aside. I walked out. I sat in my car for 15 minutes before my hands were steady enough to drive. Not shaking from fear of him, shaking because he was right. That is the most destabilizing thing a person can do to you. Not threaten you, not manipulate you. Just be correct about something you were hoping they were wrong about. Here is what I thought about that night, in my clean apartment with one chair pulled out from the kitchen table. Every choice I had made in the past 3 months had been pointed in a single direction. The research I had done into Dominic Reyes in the weeks after my father's death. The way I had tracked the pharmaceutical discrepancies at the hospital with a precision I had never applied to administrative matters before. The fact that I memorized the address before I burned the paper. I had been moving toward this for months. I had just been calling it something else. I called Dominic back 36 hours later, not 48. Camilla said, I agree. These are my conditions. She listed them clearly. Her hospital schedule was untouchable. Every relevant question got a complete and honest answer. The files on Marco Vega would be provided in stages as the project progressed. Dominic said, agreed, no hesitation, no counter. Camilla said, you do not want to negotiate anything? Dominic said, no. Your conditions are reasonable. Camilla said, people negotiate even when the conditions are reasonable. Dominic said, I know. That is why I do not. So that when I do object to something, you know it is a real reason and not a reflex. I hung up and sat with that for a while. He was teaching me his language, in a way, showing me how to read him. Most people who want to manipulate you make themselves opaque. They are unpredictable on purpose. He was doing the opposite. He was making himself legible. That was either the most trustworthy thing I had ever encountered or the most sophisticated trap I had ever seen. I spent the next 6 weeks figuring out which one it was. The first official working meeting was at a conference room in the Marriott on Boylston Street. I chose the location. Dominic had no objection. I arrived 5 minutes early. He arrived exactly on time. He brought Rafe. I had not been told about Rafe. Rafael Reyes was 29 years old, Dominic's half-brother on their father's side, and he shook my hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had been told to appear friendly and had decided to overcorrect. He had Dominic's build, but none of Dominic's stillness. Where Dominic occupied space with a kind of contained density, Rafe seemed to expand into whatever room he walked into, filling the air with movement and noise. He looked at my face. Then he looked again, a second longer than a handshake warranted. He said, "Has anyone ever told you that you have the same jawline as—" Dominic said, "Raphael." One word, low, even, carrying the weight of a relationship that went back 3 decades. Rafe stopped talking immediately, looked down at the conference table, found something very interesting in the stack of papers in front of him. I noted the exchange, filed it, did not ask about it. I have learned that the most revealing moments are often the ones people try to close off quickly. The value is not in asking about them directly. The value is in waiting. We spent the next 2 weeks finding our working rhythm, which is to say, we spent 2 weeks figuring out how to be useful to each other without stepping on each other's methods. My method is systematic, evidence-based. I move from observation to hypothesis to test to conclusion, and I do not skip steps regardless of how confident I feel. His method is something I had never seen before, and took me a while to name. He is a concentrator. When he gives you his attention, he gives you all of it, and he processes everything in the moment it arrives, rather than cycling back to it later. He rarely takes notes, because he does not need to. About 2 weeks in, I attended a vendor meeting for the clinic project. A group of medical equipment suppliers, 6 people, a conference table, coffee that had been sitting too long. Dominic sat through the entire meeting without saying a single word. He listened with the quality of attention that most people only give to things they are required to listen to. At the end of the meeting, when people were gathering their folders and reaching for their coats, he said, "The third vendor, Torres. Ask him about the August shipment from last year." Then he looked at me. He said, "You were analyzing everyone in that room." Camilla said, "Occupational habit." Dominic said, "What did you see?" That question stopped me. Not what were your conclusions, not what did you determine. What did you see? As though my observation itself had value separate from whatever I concluded from it. I answered honestly. Torres was concealing a supply problem. The second man was anxious about a timeline he was not going to meet and was keeping quiet because he was afraid of losing the contract. The man at the far end of the table cared about the project for its own sake, not primarily for the money. Dominic nodded once. He said, "I already knew about Torres. I wanted to see whether you did." Camilla said, "You were testing me." Dominic said, "I was learning about you. There is a difference." That night, driving back to my apartment, I noticed I was replaying the conversation. Not with anxiety, with something that took me a moment to identify, because it had been absent for long enough that I had forgotten what it felt like. Curiosity. I could not remember the last time I had been genuinely curious about a person. Not curious about their diagnosis or their case history or the mechanism of their symptoms. Curious about them. The way you are curious about a book that keeps surprising you. Week 3 is when the friction started. I was reviewing the clinic's pharmaceutical sourcing documents, and I found what I did not want to find. A portion of the medication supply was coming from hospital inventory, redirected through a legal gray area. The drugs had passed their paperwork expiration dates. Legally, hospitals were permitted to sell this inventory to nonprofit community clinics at reduced prices rather than discarding it. The drug efficacy was not in question. The accounting was technically clean, but the ethical density of the arrangement was significant. I put the documents on the table in front of Dominic the following morning. Camilla said, "Explain this." He looked at the papers. He did not look surprised. Dominic said, The American healthcare system discards $800 million worth of usable medication every year because paperwork says it has expired, not because the medication stopped working. People without insurance cannot access drugs at prices they can actually pay. I fill that gap with the loophole the system chose not to close. Camilla said, "That is the most elegant justification for a gray area I have ever heard." Dominic said, "I am not justifying it. I am explaining it. There is a difference." Camilla said, "Do you know where the line is?" Dominic said, "I know exactly where the line is. I choose to work at the edge of it rather than the center." Camilla said, "Why not stay in the center? Safer." He paused, the pause of a person deciding whether to answer honestly. Dominic said, "Because the center is not enough to change anything. The edge is where you can do what the center cannot." I sat back and looked at him. Camilla said, "Coming from a surgeon, I will take that as a compliment." For the first time in 3 weeks, I almost smiled. I hated myself for it. I could not stop it. Here is what I was beginning to understand about Dominic Reyes. He was not the character I had been expecting. I had expected a man who justified his actions by pretending they did not require justification. The classic method of the powerful, the strategy of people who have decided that the rules apply to others and not to them. He was not that. He knew exactly what he was doing. He could describe the moral architecture of every decision he had made, including the ones that lived in gray territory, with a clarity that most people cannot achieve even for their most unambiguous choices. That self-awareness did not erase the complexity of what he did. But it was something rarer than I would have predicted. Nora Walsh found me in the hospital cafeteria on a Friday afternoon and sat down across from me with her lunch tray and the expression she uses when she has decided something needs to be said. Nora said, "You seem different." Camila said, "Different how?" Nora said, "Less sealed, like a window that got opened a crack." Camila said, "I do not know what that means." Nora said, "I know you do not. That is why I am saying it out loud instead of waiting for you to figure it out yourself." She ate her lunch. I ate mine. We sat in comfortable silence the way we have been doing since residency, when we were too tired for conversation, but too anxious to be alone. Then Nora said, "Whoever this is, I want to be on record as being cautiously supportive before I know any of the details." I looked at her. She raised both hands in a gesture of complete innocence and went back to her sandwich. That was Nora. She had a radar for the things I was not saying that functioned more accurately than any instrument I had ever used in a clinical setting. But there were things I was not saying even to myself. Things that were moving beneath the surface of every interaction I was having in Dominic's world. Patterns I was accumulating without examining. Observations I was filing away in a part of my mind I had not opened yet. Those would become impossible to ignore soon enough. The camera in my head was always running. I just had not developed the footage yet. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th week, I was told that a donor wished to meet with the department heads at the hospital. His name was Victor Salazar. He owned a chain of pharmaceutical companies and wanted to discuss funding a research position in non-opioid chronic pain treatment. I sat across from him in Conference Room B on the 2nd floor and listened to him say exactly the right things. He was 61 years old, navy suit, impeccably fitted but not flashy, silver hair combed back with the kind of practiced neatness that is its own form of statement. His voice was warm without being performative. His questions were placed at exactly the right moments in the conversation. He looked, in every visible way, like precisely the kind of person he was presenting himself as. That was the first thing that made me question him. Real people do not look this much like their roles. People who look perfectly like their roles are usually performing them. I watched him with the part of my attention I keep running in the background of every interaction. What I saw did not match what I was hearing. His eyes were doing information gathering work, not persuasion work. There is a difference in the quality of attention. When someone is trying to convince you of something, their gaze seeks connection. When someone is collecting data, their gaze seeks surfaces. His eyes were moving across the room the way a person's eyes move when they are building a map. When he asked about my current projects, his breathing changed rhythm very slightly. The way people breathe differently when they have finally arrived at the sentence they actually came to say. And on his right hand, a signet ring. Old gold. The engraving recessed with age. The contact edge worn unevenly. Not jewelry. Something he never takes off. Something with weight. After he left, I stood in the corridor outside conference room B and did not move for about 90 seconds. He was not there to fund research. He came to observe me, and he got what he came to get. I took out my phone and called Dominic. This was the first time I had called him without being asked, and I noticed that difference as I was dialing. I was not calling out of fear. I was calling because I wanted him to know before he had to ask, which meant something had shifted in how I was operating. I was behaving like a partner, not like a person under protection. He answered before the second ring. Camila said, "Salazar was just here." Silence for one beat. Then he said, "Tell me everything." I walked him through it the way I would present a case. Systematic, specific detail in order of significance. He listened without interrupting, with that full attention quality I had come to recognize as characteristic of him. When I finished, he said, "You notice the ring?" Camila said, "Right hand ring finger, custom signet, old gold, the contact edge with the desk worn unevenly. He has a habit of tapping his finger when he thinks. He has been doing it for at least 15 years. Dominic said, "He came to confirm, not to recruit. He knows you are connected to me. I do not know yet how. But he knows." Then he told me the piece of the story I had not heard. Marco Vega was not killed by Dominic. Marco Vega was killed by Salazar. Because Marco knew too much about how Salazar ran his operations. Dominic had been used as a front for 15 years without understanding the full structure. It took him a decade to recognize what he had been part of. Another 15 years to build the evidence necessary to do something about it. Camilla said, "So the person I was told destroyed your world," Dominic said, "was working for the man who arranged for your father to sell you." The story closed into a circle in front of me. I sat with that for a moment. The way you sit with a diagnosis that changes the entire treatment plan. Everything you thought you understood about the mechanism of the disease, and then one test result comes back, and you have to rebuild the picture from scratch. He said, "The security cameras at your hospital have been tampered with externally. 2 points. The parking structure entrance and your department's service corridor." Camilla said, "Tonight." Dominic said, "I do not think your apartment is compromised, but going home alone tonight is not the wisest option available to you. You choose. You stay here or I put someone outside your building. Your call." I said I would stay. Not from fear. Because proximity to information is strategically superior to distance from it. That is what I told myself. Whether I believed it entirely is a question I am still working on. The house where Dominic lived was not what I expected, not a compound or a mansion. A penthouse unit in a quiet building in the South End. Interior dark wood and clean lines, bookshelves that matched the ones in his office, a kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and something Elena had cooked earlier in the evening. Elena Morales was 58 years old and had worked for Dominic since he was 25. She showed me to a guest room without unnecessary conversation and left fresh towels on the chair by the window. The towels were still in their original packaging. He had prepared for the possibility of this before I arrived. At 11 at night, I could not sleep. I went to the kitchen for water and found the light already on. Dominic was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He was not startled when I appeared. He poured a second cup from the pot and set it across from him without asking whether I wanted any. I sat down. We did not talk immediately. Two people who are accustomed to silence sitting together in it. The city outside made the sounds cities make very late at night, which are softer and more honest than daytime sounds. Camilla said, "Do you ever get tired of knowing everything?" Dominic said, "I do not know everything. I ask better questions than most people." Camilla said, "What is the question you cannot find the answer to?" Long pause, long enough that I thought he would let it go. Then he said, "Whether the things I have done were worth what I lost." That sentence landed differently than I expected. Not self-pity, not performance. The honest question of a man who has lived long enough to stop performing certainty he does not have. I did not try to answer it for him. I did not offer reassurance or redirect the conversation. I just let it sit there between us, which is the thing people almost never do when someone says something true and difficult. We sat for another 30 minutes. The coffee cooled. Neither of us moved. Before I went back to the guest room, I asked, "Have you found an answer?" Dominic said, "No. But this is the first time in a long time the question has felt worth answering." I thought about that for a while in the dark. A man can be dangerous and honest at the same time. A man can operate in gray territory and still have a conscience that keeps accurate accounts. These things are not mutually exclusive. I had been trained to think in clean categories: safe and unsafe, good outcome and bad outcome, bleeding controlled or not controlled. Dominic Reyes did not fit into clean categories, and the more time I spent with him, the more I suspected that the clean categories I had been applying to the world for 31 years were not as clean as I had believed. That is a disturbing thing to discover. It is also, in a strange way, a relief. Because if the categories are not as rigid as I thought, then maybe I am not as fixed as I thought either. Monday morning of the 5th week. Rafe found me in the hallway near the main office when Dominic was not around. No explanation. He just said, "You have a few minutes?" and walked down the back corridor without waiting for me to answer. I followed him to a small room at the end of the hall. The kind of room that does not announce itself. Unlocked, no label on the door, a few filing cabinets along one wall, a shelf running the length of the room at shoulder height. On the highest shelf, a plain cardboard box with nothing written on it. Rafe reached up and brought it down. Set it on the floor between us. Opened the top and took out a photograph. He held it out to me. I took it. The child in the photograph was about 3 years old. Dark curly hair. She was sitting on wooden stairs somewhere, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a white dress with a red border. The way small children sit when they have been asked to sit still for a picture and are making a concentrated effort to comply. Her eyes, amber brown, wide, looking directly at the camera with an expression of serious focus that was entirely too adult for a 3-year-old's face. My chest did something I had not given it permission to do. A shift. A recognition of some kind that arrived before I had consciously processed what I was looking at. Rafe said, "He has kept this for 25 years. He believes she died with her mother in a car accident in 2006. I am not sure that is true anymore." Camilla said, "Why are you showing me this?" Rafe said, "Because you have his eyes, Dr. Voss." He looked at me directly when he said it, no humor in his face, no deflection. The real Rafe, the one underneath the performance of easy friendliness. He said, "And nobody in this house has had the courage to say it out loud." I stood there holding the photograph of a 3-year-old with my eyes and did not move for what felt like a very long time. Camilla said, "Why not tell him directly?" Rafe looked at his hands. He said, "If I tell him, and I am wrong, I have opened a wound he spent 20 years learning to survive. If I am right, he needs to hear it from evidence, not from my hope. He has had hope taken from him too many times to trust it without something solid underneath it." He took the photograph back carefully, placed it in the box, put the box back on the shelf. He said, "You will know what to do with what you just saw." He left the room. I stayed in it for a while. Here is what I am. I am a physician. I do not act from emotion when the stakes are high. I act from evidence. Emotion is information, not instruction. It tells me where to look. It does not tell me what I will find. So I did not go to Dominic. Not yet. I went to work. I pulled my own medical records from when I was admitted to the hospital at age 6 as part of the Voss adoption process. blood type, genetic markers noted in the intake documentation. Not conclusive evidence on their own, but nothing that contradicted what I was beginning to suspect. I called a colleague in the hospital's genetics lab, requested an anonymous DNA analysis under a research pretext. Paternity determination studies. She processed them regularly. My request was not unusual. My own sample was straightforward. His was more complicated. On Wednesday morning, while Elena was briefly out of the kitchen, I exchanged Dominic's coffee cup for a fresh one, kept the original, wrapped in a paper towel inside my coat pocket. I disliked myself for this, not because it was legally problematic. Using discarded material is not a violation of anything codified. I disliked myself because I was treating this man like a case file, like a patient whose chart I was reviewing without his knowledge. But I could not move forward on hope alone. I was a physician. I needed confirmation before I could call something real. The 5 days of waiting were the strangest I had experienced in a long time. I continued working with Dominic on the clinic project. I attended meetings. I reviewed documents. I had coffee with him twice in the kitchen at odd hours, the way we had been doing. From the outside, nothing was different. From the inside, everything was filtered differently. I watched him with the specific attention you give to something you are trying to see clearly before it changes permanently. The way he held his coffee cup, both hands curved around it rather than using the handle. The 3-beat rhythm he tapped on the desk with one finger when he was listening to something that required concentration. The fact that when he smiled, and it was rare, it always started in his eyes and only reached his mouth afterward. These things felt familiar. Not in the way that things feel familiar because you have seen them before. In the way that things feel familiar because they were always part of you and you are only now recognizing where they came from. I did not allow myself to draw conclusions. I watched, I waited, I continued working. On Thursday afternoon, Nora called me. Nora said, "Something just happened, and I need to tell you before I process it into something small." A man had approached her in the hospital parking structure. Well-dressed, polite. He offered her an envelope of cash in exchange for information about my weekly schedule. Non-sensitive information, he said. Just where I was on which days. Nora told him no. Then she walked directly back into the hospital and called me. Camilla said, "Can you describe him?" She described him. I listened. Then I ended the call and immediately dialed Dominic. He answered on the first ring. Camilla said, "Nora was approached in the garage today." Dominic said, "Where are you right now?" Camilla said, "Inside the hospital." Dominic said, "I have been outside since this morning." I stopped. Camilla said, "You have been here all day?" Dominic said, "Since 7 a.m. Camilla said, "You did not tell me." Dominic said, "You would have told me to leave. I had no answer because he was right." On Friday at 6:17 p.m., I was sitting in my car in the level B2 parking structure when an email arrived from the lab. I downloaded the attachment, opened it. 28 pages of technical documentation. The conclusion was on the first page. 2 sentences. The camera in this moment, if this were a film, would not show the screen. It would show my face. I did not cry. I did not shake. What happened was smaller and heavier than either of those things. One slow breath, deep and deliberate. The kind of breath a physician takes when a diagnosis they have been carrying as a private hypothesis has just been confirmed in writing. I set the phone down. I looked through the windshield toward the building where Dominic's office window was still lit. I sat in that dark parking structure for a while, alone with what had just become true, not trying to absorb it, trying to figure out how you give someone back something they have been living without for 25 years without breaking them in the process of returning it. I thought, this is the hardest case I have ever walked into. Not because of technical complexity, because there is no protocol, no step 1 followed by step 2, no procedure mapped out in a manual somewhere, just 2 people, 1 truth, and no way to make it painless. I started the car. Some things you cannot prepare for. You can only decide to go. Saturday morning. I found Rafe in the garage. He was working on a car, the way he does when he needs somewhere to put his hands during complicated thoughts. He had grease on both arms to the elbow and was focused on something in the engine bay, with the concentration of a man who has done this enough times that the work itself is almost meditative. He heard me come in, did not look up immediately. I stood a few feet away from him and said, "The results came back." He set down the wrench, picked up a rag and wiped his hands slowly, still not looking at me. Rafe said, "Positive?" I said yes. He sat down on a plastic stool beside the car. Not a deliberate sitting. The kind of sitting that happens when a person's legs do the work without being asked to. I had never seen Rafe's legs do that before. He was quiet for a long time. Rafe said, "He is not going to know what to do. I need you to understand that. It is not that he will not want this. It is that he built himself to not expect it anymore. He does not have the architecture for it. And now it is real." Camila said, "Who told him she did not survive the accident?" Rafe said, "Someone who worked for Salazar. 3 years ago. He had been looking for 22 years. And then someone came to him with documentation and told him it was over. And he believed them because he had to. Because you cannot live inside 22 years of searching without eventually needing it to resolve one way or the other." The shape of everything became clear to me in that moment. Salazar had not just stolen 25 years from Dominic, he had managed the theft in stages. First, he arranged the separation. Then he waited until Dominic had almost found his way back to the truth and took that away too, with a document and a sympathetic face and a finality that was designed to feel like mercy, but was actually just another form of control. Camila said, "I am telling him tonight. I wanted you to know first." Rafe said, "Why?" Camila said, "Because you were the first person brave enough to say what you saw. You deserve to know what came of that." He was quiet again. Then he turned back to the car and picked up the wrench and said from behind me without turning around, "Tell him tonight. Do not give him one more night without knowing." At 8 o'clock in the evening, I went to Dominic's study. The desk lamp was on low, warm amber in the surrounding dark. Elena had brought tea and left without being asked. Dominic was going through documents, the focused, unhurried attention he brings to any work in front of him. He glanced up when I walked in, and he knew immediately that something was different. Not from my face, which I had made as neutral as I could manage. From my posture. The particular careful way I was moving across the room. The kind of careful that means the thing you are carrying is fragile. I did not speak. I crossed the room to his desk and placed the lab report in front of him. Set it down gently, the way you set down something that matters. Stepped back one step and stood still. He looked at the paper. He did not read it immediately. He looked at it first, the shape of it, as though he was recognizing the form of something before he could process the content. Then he picked it up. I watched him read. I have stood at bedsides hundreds of times. I have watched people receive information that permanently divided their lives into before and after. I know what that looks like on a human face. I know the sequence. The initial read, the pause, the second read to confirm what the first read told them, the moment when the information stops being words on a page and starts being true. He read it once, then read it again, set it down, looked up at me. His eyes were amber brown. Mine are amber brown. 25 years. Dominic Reyes put his face in his hands. 1 second. Only 1 second. Then he raised his head. His eyes were wet and he was working to keep his voice level. Dominic said, "How long have you known?" Camila said, 48 hours. Dominic said, "Why did you wait?" I thought about the honest answer, not the answer that would sound best, the actual one. Camila said, "Because I needed to be certain, and because I did not know how to give someone back something they had spent 25 years grieving without it destroying them in the process." He looked at me for a long time, the way a person looks when they are memorizing the shape of something they did not think they were still allowed to have. Then he stood, slowly, walked to the window, stood with his back to me, looking out at the city. He said, "Her mother's name was Isabel, not past tense, present. Isabel, not was Isabel, as though if he said her name in the right tense, something would remain." Camilla said, "I know. I found records. I looked for everything I could find before I came to you." He turned from the window. Something moved across his face at that. A recognition. He said, "You researched her the same way you researched me." Camilla said, "Yes." Dominic said, "What did you find?" She told him. She had found Isabel's immigration records, her gallery exhibitions, her apartment history in the South End, in the early 2000s. She had found the accident report, the one that listed a woman and an unidentified child. The same report Salazar had later used to manufacture a death certificate with a child's name on it. He listened to all of it standing at the window, then he came back to the desk and sat down. And for the first time that evening, he just looked tired. Not the tiredness of a person who has not slept, the tiredness of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of years and has just, in this moment, set it down. They talked until close to midnight. Not the way people talk in dramatic moments in films, with music underneath it and each sentence more significant than the last. They talked the way people talk when they are trying to make 25 years of absence into something that can be held in a conversation. Imperfectly, with gaps, with sentences that started and changed direction partway through. He told her about Isabel. He told her about the year after Isabel left, when he understood for the first time that he had made the classic error of the powerful, which is believing you can protect people by keeping them ignorant of the things that might frighten them. What you actually do is remove their ability to choose. Isabel did not leave because of what he was. She left because he had not trusted her enough to let her decide. Dominic said, "That is why I will not lie to someone face to face, not because it is strategic, because I know what deception does to a person you love. I know from standing on the receiving end of the decision to protect someone by hiding things from them." Camila said, "You were talking about yourself when you said that, not just about Isabel." He looked at her, said yes. She told him about the Voss family, about Edward Voss, who was not a cruel man, not a negligent man, but a man who expressed love the way men of his generation and background expressed it, which was primarily through provision and expectation, with emotional presence largely absent. He had given her every advantage. She was not ungrateful. But there is a difference between being given things and being known. Camilla said, "I did not realize how different those two things were until you asked me what I saw in that meeting room. Not what I concluded. What I saw. Nobody had ever asked me that before." Dominic said, "That should not have been the case. Not an apology, not a promise. A plain statement of something that was true and wrong." At 11:45, Elena appeared in the doorway. She looked at Dominic. She looked at Camilla. She looked at Dominic again. And she did something I had not seen her do in any of the time I had been in that house. She smiled. Not performed, not polite, real. Then she turned and went quietly back down the hall. None of us said anything after that for a while. We did not need to. Somewhere in the genetics lab at Massachusetts General Hospital, in a system log that was accessible to more people than it should have been, my name appeared alongside a specific type of analysis, submitted on a specific date. Someone was watching those logs. That person worked for Victor Salazar. By Saturday evening, Salazar knew. Not just that I was connected to Dominic, he knew the nature of the connection. He understood the implication immediately, because Salazar had been managing information about Dominic Reyes for 25 years, and he knew exactly which piece of information would change every calculation. A daughter. Not an associate, not a consultant. A daughter. Salazar was not a violent man by preference. Violence was expensive, attention-generating, and legally traceable. He had spent 3 decades building an empire specifically designed to avoid all 3 of those problems. He used violence the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, only when there was no other instrument, and only with precision. But leverage was different. Leverage was clean. Leverage worked by making the other person do what you needed without requiring you to do anything traceable. Dominic's leverage was his daughter, not to harm her, too risky, too visible, to use her. Nora Walsh lived in a brownstone in the South End, 12 minutes from the hospital, and walked to and from work when the weather permitted. On Monday evening at 8:15, she was 2 blocks from her front door when a man she had never seen before appeared beside her. He was polite. He explained calmly that Dr. Camilla Voss was a person of significant interest to his employer, that his employer had no intention of involving Dr. Walsh in anything unpleasant, and that a reasonable amount of money was available in exchange for basic information about my location on specific days. Nora Walsh is a 34-year-old internal medicine physician who grew up in a family with 3 brothers and has a temperament best described as zero tolerance for being managed. She looked at the man. She looked at the envelope he was holding out. She said, "No." Then she turned around and walked back to the hospital and called me from the parking lot. When Dominic heard the description of the man, something went quiet in him in a specific way that I was beginning to recognize. Not anger. Calculation. Dominic said, "Salazar is repositioning. He is moving to the next phase." Camilla said, "What is the next phase?" Dominic said, "You." He explained it in the direct way he explained everything. Salazar now knew about the DNA results. He knew what Camilla was to Dominic, which meant she was no longer background. She was the most significant leverage available. He said, "He will not come at you directly. Too much exposure. He will find a way to make you come to him." Camilla said, "Using Nora." He did not answer, which was its own answer. 3 nights later, at 9:23 p.m., my phone showed a text message from Nora's number. It said, "Come alone to Mass General Parking Garage, Level 3. Do not tell Reyes, or I do not go home tonight." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment. This was a trap. That was not a suspicion, it was a certainty. Nora Walsh would never write the phrase, "Do not tell Reyes." She did not know that name with the ease that sentence required. That sentence was written by someone who knew my situation, not by someone in it. But Nora was genuinely in that garage, or had been recently. The threat was real, even if the text was scripted. I thought about calling Dominic. I thought about it seriously and specifically, not as an instinct, but as a tactical option. If I called him, he would come. Salazar would see him coming. And the moment Dominic walked into that garage visible, Nora became an immediate variable in whatever Salazar did next. Salazar was afraid of Dominic. I had read that in him the first day he came to the hospital, and I had confirmed it in every piece of information I had received since. Afraid people do not confront. They maneuver. They put things between themselves and the source of their fear, and use those things as instruments. If I called Dominic and he came invisible, Nora was one of those instruments. If I went alone, Salazar wanted something from me. He needed me to do something. That meant I had a position. Small, but a position. I went to Rafe's room. He was out for the evening. On his desk, among a collection of electronic equipment I had noticed 2 weeks earlier, without specifically cataloging, was a signal-blocking device. Palm-sized. Simple trigger. I took it, left a note on his desk. Borrowed this. See. Then I went to Dominic's study. He was downstairs in a meeting. I picked up the DNA report that had been sitting on the corner of his desk since Saturday night. His copy, the one he had kept. I turned it over, wrote on the back in clear, steady handwriting. "I found you. That means something. See." I placed it back on the corner of his desk where he would see it. I left the house. I want to be precise about my mental state in the car on the way to the hospital. I was not performing bravery. I was not running on adrenaline or suppressing fear through will. I was operating the way I operate before a surgery that has a real probability of going wrong. Identified risks, identified available resources, identified the most useful course of action given imperfect options. Salazar needed me functional. That was leverage in a different direction. Whatever he wanted, he needed me cooperative enough to deliver it. That meant I had time to work with once I was in the room. The parking structure was pale yellow under fluorescent lights. Level 3. 10:47 p.m. Nora was standing near a gray sedan, not restrained. Two men close enough to be clear about the situation without being obvious about it. She looked at me when I walked in with the expression of a person who has spent the past 2 hours holding it together and is relieved that they can now partially stop. Salazar was standing to the side, not hiding behind anyone. He had come in person because he wanted to manage this directly. He said, "Dr. Voss, thank you for coming." His voice was warm, practiced, the same warmth I had read as performance the first time I met him in that hospital conference room. I walked toward him until I could see his face clearly. I read him, breathing faster than normal, his right hand working too hard at appearing relaxed. The muscles around his mouth pulled tight despite the measured tone. His eyes moved to the exit stairwell every 30 seconds. He was afraid. Not of me specifically. But the fear was present and it was shaping everything he was doing in this room. He explained what he needed. I called Dominic. I read from a prepared script. I bring him to a specific location alone. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said, "You are afraid of him." Salazar said, "I respect him." Camilla said, "No, you are afraid of him. People who respect their opponents meet them directly. People who are afraid of their opponents use hostages." He said nothing. Camilla said, "I know what you are afraid of specifically. It is his patience. You have known him for 25 years. You know when he wants to move fast, he moves fast. This time he has not moved fast. He has been building something for 15 years. And that frightens you more than anything physical he could do." Still nothing. Camilla said, "It should. And you should know that the person in this garage with nothing left to lose is not him." I reached into my coat pocket and took out Rafe's device, pressed the trigger. Every cellular signal in a 20-meter radius cut out instantaneously. Camilla said, "Nobody is calling anyone right now, including your men, which also means I cannot call Reyes, so if you want your trap to work at all, release my friend first. When she is out of sight, I will listen to whatever you want to say next." Salazar looked at me for a long moment. He looked at Nora. He looked at his men. He made a small gesture. Nora walked quickly toward the exit stairwell without looking back. The sound of a heavy door. Then silence. Salazar and I were left looking at each other in the pale yellow light. He said, "What do you want, Dr. Voss?" Camilla said, "I want you to understand that whatever you do next, you have already lost. Not because of anything in this garage. Because 25 years ago you made the mistake of underestimating someone who does not stop." He started to say something. The stairwell door opened. Dominic walked through it. He was wearing a regular coat. He had come alone. He looked like any man arriving to collect his car at the end of a late evening. He stopped when he saw the two of us. Looked at Salazar. Looked at me. Looked at the device in my hand. 3 seconds of silence. No dramatic entrance. No statement to announce himself. Just a man walking into a room and standing in it. And somehow that was enough to change every calculation in the space. I found out afterward what had happened. Elena had found the note on Dominic's desk, had read it, had gone downstairs and interrupted the meeting, something she had never done in 15 years. Had handed him the note without explanation. He had read 2 sentences and left in under a minute. He had come alone because he had seen, through the stairwell glass, that I was not in distress, that I was standing straight and speaking, that the situation had not collapsed. He trusted me enough to not come charging in and disrupt whatever I was managing. That was the moment I understood something about him that I had not fully understood before. Trust, for Dominic, was not a feeling. It was a decision expressed through action, and he had just expressed it in the clearest possible way. He looked at Salazar, and Salazar looked back, and something went out of his face. Salazar's men received calls from Dominic's people who had been positioned on levels 1 and 2 since before I arrived. Not a confrontation, just the information that the exits were covered and that the preferred resolution was a conversation. There was no violence. There was not going to be violence. That was never the point. Salazar's men stepped back. Not far, but enough. Dominic looked at Salazar with the particular quality of attention he brings to things that require precision. He said, 25 years. His voice was exactly the same as it was in any meeting. Measured, level, the voice of a man who has not needed volume to be heard since he was in his 20s. Dominic said, I gave you 25 years, not because I did not know, because I needed evidence that no attorney on earth could take apart. Evidence that documented not just what you did, but the full structure of how you did it and who you did it to. Salazar said, You cannot have enough evidence to Dominic said. The FBI Boston field office received a package 40 minutes ago. The DEA received a second. The State Attorney General's office received a third. The investigative journalist at the Globe who has been working your story for 3 years, but was missing the final connection, received a fourth. All of them tonight, all from different sources. Silence. Salazar said, What is in them? Dominic said, Your pharmaceutical falsification operation from 2009 forward. The accounts used to move money through your legitimate company structure. The names of 14 patients who died because of adulterated product from your supply chain. Deaths that were recorded as medical complications in files that were never examined because the right people were never looking. And the contract you signed with Marco Vega in 2006, including the specific line items. He paused. He said, You have one option available to you that does not end with an indictment before the end of the week. Friday morning, 9 o'clock. FBI Field Office at One Center Plaza. You ask for Agent Rodriguez. You bring everything I do not already have. In exchange, I do not release Package 5. Salazar said, What is Package 5? Dominic said, The reason you went to the trouble of making sure I believed my daughter died in that accident 20 years ago. Something went through Salazar's face. Not calculation. Not the practiced composure of a man who has been managing information and people for 3 decades. Something older and more fundamental. For the first time that evening, he looked his age. He said, You would still hand me to the FBI. After everything. Dominic said, I am handing you to the FBI because of everything. There is no other way this ends that is actually an ending. Salazar was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Friday. Dominic said, 9 a.m. He turned and walked toward the stairwell, passed me close enough to speak quietly. He said, Good call with the jammer. Then he went through the door. I stood in the garage for another moment after that, in the yellow light, with the signal-blocking device still in my hand. I thought about something a professor of mine said in my first year of medical school. She said that the most important skill a physician develops is not diagnostic accuracy or technical proficiency. It is the ability to hold complexity without resolving it prematurely. To sit with a situation that has multiple possible explanations and not collapse it into a simpler version of itself just because the simpler version is more comfortable. I had been doing that for weeks, holding the complexity of Dominic Reyes, of what he was and what he did and what he might be to me, without resolving it into something easier. And what I had found in the end was not a simple answer. There was no simple answer. But there was a true one. He had waited 25 years to do the right thing. Not because he was afraid to move sooner, because he understood that the right thing done at the wrong moment with insufficient evidence is not justice. It is just more violence in a different direction. Patience is not weakness. I knew that intellectually. Watching him, I understood it in a way that does not come from intellectual understanding. On Friday at 9:02 in the morning, Victor Salazar walked into the FBI field office at One Center Plaza, wearing a navy suit. He went voluntarily. That fact would become relevant in the legal proceedings that followed. He had made the calculation that cooperation offered the best available outcome, which was the kind of calculation a man makes when the evidence against him is genuinely complete. I found out from Dominic at 11 that morning, between patient appointments. I went to the hospital bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror for about 30 seconds. Then I went back out and finished my rounds. That afternoon in Dominic's office, Dominic said, "The clinic project was not only a clinic project." Camilla said, "I know, I figured that out around week 3. Dominic said, "And you stayed." Not a question. Camilla said, "I stayed because by week 3 I already knew what I was helping to build. And I knew that the people whose deaths were listed as medical complications deserved to have that evidence organized and delivered correctly. I did not know my personal connection to it until later, but that did not change what they deserved." He looked at her for a moment. Dominic said, "You are a better person than I am." Camila said, "I am not. I just have the advantage of not being the person who was directly hurt. That is not virtue. It is distance." He said nothing after that for a moment, just looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her now, which was still the same focused quality of attention, but with something underneath it that had not been there before she placed that lab report on his desk. Later that day, I found Nora in the hospital cafeteria and told her what I could tell her. Not everything. Enough. She listened without interrupting, which for Nora represents a significant expenditure of personal restraint. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Nora said, "The man who was standing outside our hospital every single morning for 2 months." Camilla said, "My father, apparently." Nora said, "Camila." Camila said, "I know." Nora said, "He is very." Camila said, "Nora." Nora said, "Your father. I understand. I am done." She ate a bite of her lunch. Then she looked at me the way she has looked at me since residency, when something important is happening, and she needs me to know that she sees it. She said, "Are you okay?" I thought about the honest answer. I said, "I do not know what okay looks like anymore. But I think this might be the first time I have been okay in the real sense. Not okay as in everything is under control. Okay as in I know who I am and I know where I come from." Nora nodded once. She said, "That sounds more like you than anything else that has happened to you. You have never done something where you already knew how it would turn out." I looked at her. She said, "That is why you are good in the OR, Camila. You are not afraid of the process. You are afraid of there being no process at all." I sat with that for a while. She was right. She usually was, about the things that mattered. 1 week after Salazar walked into the FBI field office, I stayed overnight in Dominic's house because I chose to. Not because circumstances required it. Not because staying was strategically sensible. Because I opened my own front door, stood in my apartment for about 4 minutes, and then picked up my keys and drove back across the city. I did not analyze the decision extensively. I made it and went. In the morning, the kitchen was full of light from the large south-facing windows. My apartment has a north-facing kitchen because I chose it for proximity to the hospital and not for any other reason. I had not thought about the direction of morning light in years. Elena set coffee in front of me without being asked. Not the practiced efficiency of a person performing a function. Something else. A quality of attention that was warm without being performed. Dominic appeared at 7:15. Exactly on time, same as every morning. His routine unmodified by the presence of a person in his house who had not been invited so much as expected. This told me something important about him. He did not adjust his presentation for an audience. He was the same person in every room regardless of who was watching. I had observed this over weeks and understood it now in a way that went past intellectual acknowledgement. We sat at the kitchen table, comfortable silence of the kind that only develops between people who have spent enough time together to not need to fill every gap. He said, "I do not know how to do this." He was not talking about coffee. I set my cup down. I said, "Neither do I. I have only ever been a daughter to people who bought me. I do not know what this looks like when it is real." He said, I do not know what it looks like to have something back that I thought was gone. A pause. He said, I think we could figure it out. Badly, probably. Slowly, definitely. I looked at him across the table. For the first time since I had met him, his face had something in it that had not been there before. Not softness. That is not the right word for Dominic Reyes. Openness. The quality of a window being raised after a very long winter. I said, You just described exactly how every surgical skill I have ever learned was taught to me. He looked mildly surprised. He said, Then you have more patience for the process than I do. I said, Yes, I do. That afternoon, the three of us were in the study. Rafe was nominally reviewing something on his laptop. Camilla said, I am not leaving my work. The hospital is the hospital. Dominic said, I understand. Camilla said, I am not moving in here. Dominic said, That is reasonable. Camilla said, I am not going to disappear into your world. Dominic said, I would not want you to. She looked at him. She said, Then how does this actually work? He said, I do not know. But you come when you want to. I will not ask for a schedule, no calendar, no expectations about timing. You come when you are ready, and you leave when you need to. Rafe looked up from his laptop. He said, Uncle Dom, she just said she is not moving in, and you smiled. Dominic said, I nodded. Rafe said, That is your smile. You have one smile and it looks like a nod, but it is definitely a smile. He looked at Rafe. Then he looked at Camilla. He said, She states a decision and moves forward without asking for my input. A pause that was barely a pause. He said, Her mother used to do exactly that. The room went completely quiet. That sentence, smaller than anything else said in the entire story, landed heavier than all of it. Not because of its content, because it was said simply, the way you say something that is just true, without performing the weight of it. And in that simplicity was something that could not have been manufactured or arranged. None of us spoke for a moment. Rafe looked at his laptop with the focused attention of a person who is not reading a single word on the screen. Camilla stood and looked at the bookshelf and was not reading the spines of any books. Dominic sat with his hands around his coffee cup and said nothing further. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms around something real when everyone present is letting it settle. That evening, before I left, Elena found me in the front hallway. She had something in her hand, small. She held it out on her palm and I took it. An infant bracelet, fine gold chain, a small clasp engraved on one side. I tilted it toward the hallway light and read the name, Lucia. Elena said, He kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk for 25 years. Every year on her birthday, he would open that drawer. Not take it out. Just open the drawer and leave it open for a little while, then close it again. She said, He will never give that to you directly. Not because he does not want to, because he does not believe he has earned the right to offer it. I said, He is wrong about that. She said, I know he is, but guilt does not respond to logic. I held the bracelet in my palm for a moment, looked at the name, Lucia, a name chosen before everything went wrong, a name that was never spoken aloud to the person it belonged to. I put it in the inside pocket of my coat, close to my chest. Elena said, You are not going to wear it? I said, Not yet, but I am going to carry it. That is enough for right now. She nodded. One nod, deliberate and certain, the nod of someone who has seen enough of life to understand that enough is sometimes exactly the right amount. I walked to my car, put my hand over the outside of my coat for a moment, felt the small weight of the bracelet through the fabric. Then I drove home. 6 weeks later. Not 6 weeks of drama. 6 weeks of ordinary life, 2 ordinary lives, slowly developing the habit of each other's presence without losing the specific shape of what they each were before. On a Tuesday morning, I was at the sink before a surgery, and Nora was beside me going through pre-op notes. She glanced at my left wrist. then glanced again. The infant bracelet, worn loose, like a bracelet, the fine gold links catching the light from the overhead fluorescence. Nora did not say anything. She looked at me and gave one small nod. I did not explain. She did not ask. In the OR, when I raised my arm to coordinate the team, the bracelet slid toward my wrist. One small motion. No one else noticed. I noticed. That morning passed the way good surgeries pass, which is to say, with a complete absence of memorable moments and a complete presence of correct ones. On Monday of the same week, Rafe walked into Dominic's office and stopped. There was a new photograph on the desk, corner position, right side. A phone photo printed on paper, slightly soft at the edges. Me, standing at a hospital corridor window, looking out at something, not aware of being photographed. Late afternoon light falling across one shoulder. Rafe stood looking at it for a moment. He said, "When did you start keeping photographs on your desk, Dom?" Dominic said, "Yesterday." Rafe said, "I mean in the entire history of your—" Dominic said, "Yesterday, Rafe." Rafe sat down at his own chair across the room, opened his laptop, and said nothing else. But he was smiling when he opened it. They met on Wednesday evenings. No one named the arrangement, no formal proposal. Just Wednesday, 7 o'clock, Dominic's kitchen, coffee and whatever Elena had made, and time that belonged to the two of them without needing to be defined as anything. Not a date, not a family dinner, not therapy, not a reconciliation meeting, or a scheduled check-in, or any of the labeled things that people use to make new arrangements feel structured. Just two people who had found each other late and were handling that fact with the care it deserved. On the 6th Wednesday, they had talked about a surgery I had done that week. A 9-year-old with a posterior fossa tumor. Successful, but with one moment in the middle where the margins were less clear than I would have liked. He listened the way he always listened to me talk about work. Completely, no interruption, no advice unless requested. Then they talked about the clinic, which was running legitimately now, with a proper nonprofit filing and a waiting list that had grown to 63 people in the first month. She had helped design the intake process, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about building a system from the beginning, rather than working within one that already existed. Then the comfortable silence. She set her cup down and looked at him. Camilla said, "You told me once that you ask better questions than most people." He looked up from his cup. Camilla said, "Is there one you have been avoiding?" One beat. Then he did not avoid it. Dominic said, "Are you staying? Not in this house, not in his world. Just staying. Present. In each other's lives in whatever form those lives were going to take." Camila said, "I am not going anywhere." He nodded. Once. Not a smile, not an embrace, not a declaration of anything. The nod of a man who has received what he needed and is grounded enough not to require more than that. The kitchen was quiet. Elena was standing at the doorway. She had come for something she needed from the counter. She was now standing still with it in her hands, not stepping in, not stepping out. Camilla said, "The coffee is cold." Dominic said, "I know. I have never been a fast drinker." Camilla said, "Neither have I." Elena stepped back from the doorway and moved quietly down the hall. The expression on her face, small and private, was not visible to anyone in the kitchen, but it was there. "I want to tell you something before I finish. I spent 31 years not knowing where I came from. Not in the simple sense. I knew the Voss family, I knew their house, I knew the schools they sent me to, and the expectations they held for me, and the particular mixture of genuine care and emotional unavailability that constituted being loved by them. I am not ungrateful. Edward Voss gave me the education that made me a surgeon. He gave me a name that opened doors. He gave me, in his own limited way, a version of safety. But there is a difference between being given things and being known. And I did not understand how wide that difference was until I sat across a kitchen table from a man who asked me what I saw, not what I concluded. Who listened when I talked about work with the quality of attention that says your words are landing somewhere, not just being received and stored. who kept a bracelet in a desk drawer for 25 years because a person he loved had worn it and he could not bring himself to throw it away and could not bring himself to offer it. Dominic Reyes is not a simple man. He has done things I cannot fully endorse. He has operated in spaces where the moral accounting is not clean. He will tell you this directly if you ask him, because honesty delivered face to face is the one principle he holds without exception, even when the honest thing makes him look worse, especially then. But he also built something real. He identified a gap in a broken system and filled it with his own hands. He waited 25 years to deliver justice through a process that would last, rather than a reaction that would only satisfy the immediate need. He sat with a question about whether what he had done was worth what it had cost him, and he sat with it honestly instead of manufacturing a comfortable answer. I learned something from watching him that I could not have learned from anyone who lived entirely within the lines. Real strength is not the capacity to harm. It is the capacity to choose not to, and to build something more lasting from that choice. Self-discipline is not deprivation. Patience is not absence of desire. And the most intelligent thing you can do in a situation where you have the power to destroy something is to wait until you understand exactly what you are building instead. The most dangerous man in Boston locked a door and told me that I had walked in of my own choosing. He was right. I had. And of every choice I have made in 31 years of living, that is the one I would not take back. Not because it was easy, because it was real. And I had spent long enough in a life that was organized and clean and careful and controlled without being real, to know the difference. Elena left a second cup on the counter the following Wednesday. Without being asked, without comment, just placed it beside the pot before she went to bed, so that it was there when it was needed. Small things. That is how belonging announces itself. Not in grand declarations or formal ceremonies, in second cups left on counters, in photographs placed on corners of desks, in bracelets worn loose on wrists, fine gold catching surgical light for a fraction of a second, visible only to the person wearing them. I carry the name Camilla Voss. I was given that name by people who purchased me and raised me in the specific way they knew how to raise a child, which was imperfect in the way all human raising is imperfect. I do not disown that name. It is the name I practiced medicine under. It is the name my patients know. But I also carry, in an inside pocket close to my chest, a name that was chosen for me before everything went wrong. A name that was spoken by a man in a hospital room 25 years later with his face in his hands, 1 second of something he could not hold back, then steadied. Lucia. I have not decided yet whether I will take it. That is not a decision you make quickly or from pressure or from obligation. You make it when you understand what it means to you, not what it means to anyone else. But I carry it. And some mornings, in the kitchen with the south-facing windows, over coffee that neither of us drinks fast enough, in the comfortable silence of two people learning each other late, I think I am beginning to understand what it means. That is enough. For right now. That is more than enough. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
Before you go, I want to take a moment with you, because this story was never really about the pharmaceutical networks. It was never about the FBI packages or the parking garage or the signal jammer. Those were just the surface, the machinery that moved the plot forward. What this story was actually about is something much quieter and much more difficult. It was about the cost of hiding the truth from people you love. Dominic Reyes built walls around everything that mattered to him. He thought silence was protection. He thought if the people closest to him did not know the full picture, they could not be hurt by it. He learned, at the highest possible price, that he was wrong. You do not protect someone by keeping them in the dark. You only remove their ability to choose. And when the truth arrives anyway, which it always does, they leave not because of what you are, They leave because you did not trust them enough to let them decide. That lesson cost him 25 years. The second thing this story was about is patience as a form of strength that our culture has almost completely forgotten how to respect. We live in a world that rewards the fast reaction, the immediate response, the visible move. Dominic waited 25 years, not because he was weak, not because he was afraid, because he understood something that most people never learn. The right action taken at the wrong moment with insufficient evidence is not justice. It is just more damage pointed in a different direction. Real power is not the ability to strike. It is the discipline to wait until what you build will actually last. The third thing, and perhaps the most personal, is this. There is a difference between being given things and being known. Camilla Voss had everything: education, career, stability, a name that opened doors. She had been provided for in every measurable way. And she spent 31 years quietly hollow because none of the people around her had ever simply asked her what she saw, not what she concluded, not what she achieved, what she saw. That is what belonging actually is. Not provision, not protection, not even love in the grand declarative sense. It is someone sitting across a kitchen table and wanting to know what the world looks like through your specific eyes. The most dangerous man in Boston understood that. In the end, he was the most honest person in the room. And that is the lesson this story leaves with you. Truth, patience, and the courage to be known. Those three things will take you further than anything else you will ever build.